This is Judaism Unbound, episode 44, A Secular Humanistic Hanukkah. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
And we're here today with Rabbi Adam Chalom, the Dean North America of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, which is the arm of the organization primarily responsible for training rabbis and other leaders of the movement, as well as publishing material and hosting seminars and colloquia that explore the ideas behind the movement. Rabbi Chalom is also the rabbi of Kol Hadash Humanistic Congregation in Lincolnshire, Illinois. He is an old friend and somebody who thinks a lot about the way in which many secular humanistic Jews in America today, whether they're members of the movement or not, might think about the pieces of Judaism that maintain their relevance in a time in which Jews may not believe in some of the theological underpinnings of Judaism as it evolved over much of its history. So we're excited to talk to Rabbi Chalom today about the movement in general, as well as some of the applications of that thinking to the holiday of Hanukkah, which we're exploring as part of this arc. So Adam Chalom, thank you so much for joining us today on Judaism Unbound. We're thrilled to finally have you on.
Thank you for having me.
We're in this sequence of episodes where we're really looking about Hanukkah, specifically inspired by the fact that Hanukkah, the first day of Hanukkah this year takes place on Christmas Day. The first night of Hanukkah is Christmas Eve. And so we thought it was a particularly interesting time to kind of explore Hanukkah in our time, in our place. We definitely are hoping that out of the secular humanistic movement will come some interesting ideas. But before we jump into Hanukkah, and we'll come back to the movement in the later part of the conversation, but just to get us started, could you tell our listeners a little bit about secular humanistic Judaism as a movement who may not be familiar with it?
Sure. The essence of secular humanistic Judaism is a cultural Jewish identity celebrated through a human-focused philosophy. So for us, our Jewish connection is to be part of the Jewish people, Jewish history, Jewish language, Jewish music, Jewish food, Jewish jokes. These are all parts of ways that we express our connection to the Jewish family. And really that sense of a family identity is useful because it also opens the doors to those who join the family by marrying in or by choosing to be adopted into the people. And it allows for a variety of ways to connect to one's heritage. And that really also is an important concept for us, the concept that Jewishness is a heritage. It's an inheritance. It's not the same as being a museum curator where you have to keep things exactly the same. Rather, it becomes yours. And so it's yours to use as you choose, to adapt, to select from. It's all yours, all of this Jewish inheritance, both what you love and what you don't agree with. But your home is still your home. And so you still get to choose from that background what speaks to you, what's most meaningful, and from other families and other traditions. Estate sales happen for every cultural tradition, and we get to choose from those that which inspires us and may influence our Jewishness as well. So we have a foot in both worlds, a foot in the wider world of human experience, human knowledge, science, reason, history, beauty, etc. And we also have a foot deeply rooted in the Jewish experience, and that is the two sides of our identity.
Is there a distinction that you can make between secular humanistic Judaism as a movement and just the fact that many Jews are secular humanists?
I sometimes make a distinction between self-aware secular Jews and secularized Jews. So secularized Jews are Jews who've been impacted by the general cultural and historical process of secularization. They live less and less religious lives. They're less and less convinced of the beliefs that religion wants them to believe. They don't follow the ritual practices. They don't recite the prayers. So they're secularized. A certain subset of secularized Jews actually want to express and explore what it means to be both Jewish and secularized. And those are the ones who are, in some ways, primed to find a meaningful experience in a secular humanistic Jewish community. They may have children they want to educate in Jewish culture and history and language and so on. They may themselves be looking for a connection with like-minded people who have similar values and a similar connection to Jewish culture in a secular, non-supernatural way. And they may also be simply looking for education, inspiration. The reason people join any kind of Jewish community, secular Jews may feel those needs and want to meet those needs in a secular way. So there's going to be a larger audience of Jews who are secularized than will ever be members of secular humanistic Jewish communities. But for those who do find it meaningful and who do seek it out, They will find a community that speaks to their values, where they can feel consistent in how they live and believe every day and in their Jewish life, and they can find inspiration in a way that doesn't make them feel inauthentic or hypocritical, saying things they don't believe. They want to say what they believe, and they should be able to say that in a Jewish register.
The word humanist, I'm intrigued by, because often I hear the discourse about sort of the place of God in this thing called Judaism is often all over the place. And we talk a lot about, Jewish atheists or people who are agnostics, but I feel like I don't really know what humanist means. So as you said, so you mentioned human-centered. Is this sort of an oppositional, we are not God-centered kind of focus? Or is this more proactively, we're focused on humans and, you can believe in God, not believe in God, whatever your God stuff is, we're human-focused?
Well, some people imagine that a secular Judaism is either shaking your fist at the sky, that you're very angry at something that isn't there, or it's a bunch of subtraction, like a Siddur that looks like a CIA redacted document with lots of blackouts and blanks, like we've just cut everything out. But the reality is that a self-aware, creative, non-religious approach to Judaism, again, is meeting those needs in a different way. It's not an empty cart, to use the Israeli metaphor of the secular Jew is the empty cart and the religious Jew is the full cart. We filled our cart with different things. So I often will explain the difference in focus between looking up at the beyond and looking out at each other and looking in at ourselves. So it's a change in direction. It's not an oppositional thing. It's a substitutional thing or a reorientation. So, for example, for the high holidays that were passed, for Yom Kippur, rather than looking above for forgiveness, we look out to each other and we look inside to try and forgive ourselves for the failures that we've had. And this is not in opposition to a traditional approach. Many people know the source, that you can't ask for divine forgiveness until you get forgiveness from the person that you've wronged. And so, again, our approach is to change the orientation. Rather than add the supernatural direction, we might add the internal direction or explore more of what it means to be in relation to each other. So that's why we chose the term humanistic. And I say we, this happened in the 1960s before I was born. So our movement chose the word humanistic because it was a positive statement of belief. We do believe in the power of human beings, in the responsibility of human beings, in what people can know and discover about the world, in the fact that we have to rely on ourselves for justice because the universe and lightning bolts are not reliable to punish the wicked or reward the righteous. And therefore, that's the positive focus. Every media program I do, people ask me, so are you an atheist? And I always respond to them calmly, I'm a humanist. I have positive beliefs. I'm not defined by what I don't believe. There are a range of theological perspectives that might find a comfortable home in a humanistic congregation. You could get people who are, the classic term is a deist, who believes in a God who began the world a long time ago and no longer intervenes. You could believe in some kind of force out there that may or may not have some impact. You could be a total flaming atheist. You could be an agnostic who doesn't know. You could be someone who just doesn't care about that question. Their life is organized around different issues.
We were talking a few weeks ago, or I guess a few months ago, with someone else about different approaches to Judaism, and it struck me just as one example of sort of a very different approach to Judaism was secular Zionism. And one of the things that would happen if you came to a secular Zionist and you said, "Tell me about your Shabbat services," they would say, "No, we don't have Shabbat services. This is an entirely different approach to Judaism." But you do have Shabbat services. And I'm curious about the way in which secular humanistic Judaism as a movement has used some of the technologies, I guess, of religious Judaism in different ways. And as we move into thinking about Hanukkah and thinking about the holidays, I think maybe this is an interesting bridge to saying, how do you take, for example, a holiday like Hanukkah that at least traditionally has been defined in around one of two miracles, right? Either God allowed us to win a great victory, even though we were the minority and the weak ones, but we won anyway, or God made this oil last for 8 days that was only enough oil to last for one day. And nevertheless, you celebrate Hanukkah, but I would imagine in a different way. And why sort of not reject these religious technologies and why embrace them, and how do you sort of repurpose them?
Well, your example is a very good one because the earlier versions of secular Jewish identity and community, which go back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, whether it was secular Zionists or also secular Yiddishists, Jewish socialists who also created secular Jewish communities and schools, they often rejected the holidays and the events that they felt were too religious. They didn't do bar and bat mitzvahs, for example, because that was about commandments. They didn't do Shabbat. They didn't do Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur because those were religious. They might do Lag BaOmer because it remembers Rabbi Akiva and the Bar Kokhba revolt, but they wouldn't do Shavuot because that was, from their mind, about the revelation at Sinai. So they would pick and choose from that library of what they felt they could secularly adapt. What we've done in secular humanistic Judaism since the 1960s is try to approach Jewish religion as an expression of Jewish culture. So that's the key in which it was expressed. So maybe we can transpose it a bit to a secular key, but still incorporate many of those cultural elements like seasonal holidays or even ceremonial holidays that we can adapt in some way. Now, we haven't kept all the minor fast days, for example. That's not a big seller. But doing Shabbat periodically is a time of rest, of stopping, of contemplation, of feeling connected to a community. Those are all very human needs that can be met in a very secular way. So we don't have the same Siddur, the same prayer book that we use every single week. Each community creates their own and has their own variety of topics they might choose from. Maybe the sermon topic is on the history, and so you do a service focused on the theme of time and the passage of time. You would choose readings and poetry and songs from both Jewish and non-Jewish culture on that theme. You would have Hebrew songs generally, or Yiddish or other Jewish languages, and then the readings in English generally because you want people to understand and feel moved, inspired, and made thoughtful by them. Again, we're trying to meet these human needs, so we create a space for memorial reflection, just like you would have a mourner's Kaddish in a traditional service. We create a space for sharing joys and concerns, which is a Unitarian tradition that we've adapted to being Jewish by calling it Simchas and Tzuras, which means joys and difficulties. But it's a chance for the community to share what's happening in their life, and that can be very meaningful too. But none of these elements, none of these human needs require supernatural prayer, invocation, or recitation of the traditional liturgy. Some communities adapt the traditional liturgy and have more Hebrew. Others are more willing to go off the script and create something fresh. In the end, we've even chosen to keep terms like synagogue and rabbi because, again, synagogue in Hebrew Beit Knesset means a house of meeting. It doesn't have to be a Beit El. That was the temple. Now, there are synagogues that are called Beit El, and at one point the Talmud said you should never call a synagogue a Beit Am, a house of the people. In fact, that is what our synagogues are. They are houses for the people. They are places for us to meet each other and to be together. Hanukkah is a very interesting case because there is a prehistory to the rabbinic version of it. Many of us are familiar with the Maccabean version of the victory, but there may be an even earlier origin story for that holiday. It may not have escaped the notice of some of your audience that there are other cultures that light lights at that time of year. In Hindu culture, there's a festival called Diwali. Japanese have a lighting holiday near the end of the what we would call our calendar year. The Roman festival of the rebirth of the sun happened in the same time of the year, near that winter solstice. Arthur Waskow, in his book Seasons of Our Joy, makes a very trenchant observation when he points out that Hanukkah, being near the end of a Jewish month, is going to be one of the darkest nights that's out there. It may not be the shortest day. It's not connected to the solstice. But it's going to be one of the darkest nights because it's the end of the moon cycle and near the solstice. So it's a long night that's very dark. So in some ways it's a festival of darkness, and that's why you light one light, then two light, then three light, then four. You make the light burn brighter as a way to help the sun burn brighter. So there's a sort of pre-Jewish, pagan, common human inheritance origin to the holiday. The second way you can approach Hanukkah is look at the Jewish history of the holiday, because the story of the miracle of the lights doesn't appear until around the year 500 of the Common Era. The Maccabees themselves lived around 160 BCE. When you read the books of Maccabees, they give you alternate reasons for why it's an 8-day holiday. One of them says it was like the rededication of the temple that took as a model on the version in 1 Kings, where it's an 8-day holiday to dedicate the first temple under Solomon. The second book of Maccabees says it was like Sukkot, out of season. They were traveling around. They couldn't build their sukkahs and bring their species, and so they did that out of season in Kislev, And guess what? Sukkot has 7 days and Shemini Atzeret, the 8th day. So these are two alternate reasons for why it's 8 days that come out of Jewish historical sources in the book of Maccabees that are only 100 years or so after the Maccabees lived. So part of what we do in teaching about Hanukkah and in celebrating it is learn the real history of these layers of meaning, how it changed meaning over time, and how the rabbis changed it and twisted it a little bit. And we also like to play historical detective. So you may have heard a story when you were in Sunday school that the dreidel began as a cover story during the pre-Maccabean revolt persecution. The Jews would get together to study Torah, and if the Greek soldiers would come in, they would pull out these dreidels and claim they were just playing a game. But if you think about it historically, what were on those cover story dreidels? A great miracle will happen here? Because this is before the rededication of the temple and the revolt. What are they doing playing dreidel? And they wouldn't have called it dreidel, of course, because that's Yiddish. In reality, we found medieval archaeological ruins in Germany and Central Europe that have four-sided tops with the English letters N, G, H, and S on them. Now, were they copying from the Hebrew? No. This was a game in German. You got N, nicht, nothing. You got G, ganze, the whole thing. You got H, halb, half. You got an S, stell ein, put one in. That's how it worked. Those were the rules. And so the Jews adopted this game, wrote it in Hebrew letters, just like Yiddish is German and Hebrew letters. And then later on, someone came up with the idea of Nes Gadol Haya Sham, and then later on in Israel, Nes Gadol Haya Po. And that's how the symbol began. So we still play the game. They still learn the traditional phrase in our school, but they also learn the real history behind the evolution of the holiday. And the agenda for all of this history is not just because I like history, which I do. It's also because people should see that as Jewish history has changed in the past, as Jewish culture has evolved in the past, so too can it evolve in our own days and going forward. You can create your own games. You can add your own minis to the holiday. Maybe we think about the importance of giving gifts instead of simply getting gifts. We're not unique to doing that. Other movements are doing that too. But that's a wonderful reinterpretation of the holiday. If it evolved in the past, it can evolve even today.
You know, I'm thinking about the way that somebody could take a holiday like Hanukkah and say, okay, now we've kind of scratched away at all the mythology, right? And we found the true history. And I guess the question is, can you build an emotionally powerful holiday out of that historical reality? Or, we were recently talking to Yehuda Kurtzer, who talks about the distinction between history and memory, and the idea that memory is not necessarily historical, and that there's even something, this is not what he says, but I'm trying to take it, even the memory that we used to have this mythology that we believed in, right, is a powerful force in thinking about moving forward. And also maybe, I'm thinking also about Joseph Campbell and the ideas of the sort of psychodrama of mythology is really getting at something that's deeply psychologically true, even though the story that it's packaged in is not actually true. How do we maintain some of those forces in Judaism once we've secularized it and once we've sort of popped the balloon of the mythology?
Well, the question is exactly what you ended up with, that once you accept that it's mythology, it doesn't function the same way. It's more like a performance than it is you actually feel like you're living it. So this happened with Passover maybe 12, 13 years ago. Most archaeologists have a consensus that there was not an exodus the way it was described in the Bible. There wasn't 600,000 men and however many women and children leaving through the desert. There isn't evidence of that. There are plenty of alternate explanations for where the stories come from and so on. And yet, David Wolpe, a very famous conservative rabbi in Los Angeles, got up in front of his congregation at their congregational Seder, and he said, well, we all know the Exodus didn't really happen the way it's described in the Haggadah. Boom! Everybody flipped out. What do you mean? And I love the quote in the LA Times story about it. One person said, did he have to say it at the Seder? Like, he can say it in the adult ed class in the library last week, but does he have to say it at the Seder? And Wolpe's point, which is our point as well, was that this is what is, and if we want to tell the story as a story, it can have the power of other literature. but we don't have to be agnostic on whether or not it actually happened. So we tell the story of the miracle of the lights. We want our kids to be culturally literate in Jewish mythology, literature, whatever you call it. It's going to have a different impact. After all, the point of the rabbis telling the miracle of the oil story in the first place was to change the hero of the story. It wasn't Judah Maccabee now. The whole point of the story was the miracle. And the hero of the story is God in the rabbinic version of it. So now we're shifting it again to talk about the Maccabees and to give an honest perspective on the Maccabees. Honestly, Hanukkah is a great lesson in the dangers of fanaticism, because the Maccabees themselves were no ACLU Democrats. I mean, they went around and forcibly converted surrounding peoples, including forcibly circumcising them. You know, in some ways they have more in common, you know, lahavdil, you'd say in Hebrew, to make a distinction, but they have some similarities with Islamic fundamentalists we see today running around forcing men to grow beards and forcing women into purdah and other discriminatory positions. The reality is that the Maccabees themselves had this kind of fanatic element. The first person killed in the Maccabean revolt was another Jew who was willing to sacrifice to the idols, if you read the book of Maccabees. So the reality is that the Maccabees can be an object lesson in the need for tolerance, but also the need for self-assertion. So you can draw on these themes of why is it important to be different? In some ways, that's what Hanukkah is now. If you assert that I'm doing Hanukkah and not Christmas, or Hanukkah and not nothing, you've asserted a difference. And so what does it mean to continue to assert a Jewish difference, even as we are very well integrated into surrounding cultures? And maybe our family has elements of both Jewish and non-Jewish biography in our family structure. I mean, I'll give you one last example. I will bet you in American Jewish homes today, more people are familiar with Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song than with Mao's Sur, Rock of Ages. Why? Because it celebrates identity and connection and Jewishness, and it's funny, and it's in English, and there's all kinds of reasons. But the traditional observance doesn't speak to them as much as this statement of Hanukkah is a statement of Jewish identity. It's saying I am Jewish, and or at least I have a partly Jewish family if you're in a family that does both. So that's part of the evolving process of the holiday, that it's changed over the centuries.
I found myself resonating with, especially with the elements you talked about in terms of the David Wolpe story, and this conception that we might think whatever we think, but in particular context, be they services or other sort of quote unquote official forms of Judaism, we have to stick to the traditional line. And I found myself flashing to another area where I think that sometimes is the case, which is the Sunday school classroom, our educational world. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how that God-centered narrative sometimes plays out in educational systems, even, I mean, this is my thought, even when people don't necessarily want to, when people want to be communicating, you know, just cool stories, mythology, as you talked about, but because we're used to the language of, you know, God led us out of Egypt, we talk about it as a historical truth because maybe, you know, it's hard to tell 7-year-olds more complicated narratives than this really happened. I mean, it's tricky. But I'm curious to hear how in that other space of, you know, where we pass on our collective mythology narrative, how we could think about the human-centered narrative in a different way.
Well, this is where having a consistently humanistic approach to Jewish life has its benefits. I often would want to ask David Wolpe, you know, he was sort of surprised at the reaction he got by saying the Exodus didn't really happen historically. But my question is, what do you say when you take the Torah scroll out? Do you say this is the Torah that Moses placed from the mouth of God by the hand of Moses? What do you teach in your Sunday schools? Do you teach them the historical archaeology, or do you only teach them the story? Have you laid the ground for making this kind of a statement at the Seder? You don't just drop it in the Haggadah. You don't just make it at the Seder. It's part of what you do all the time. And so in secular and humanistic Jewish communities, that's how we approach the stories as well. Now, I would give kids a little more credit. They can often understand the difference between story and history, between make-believe and reality. I'll often use the example, let's say you're pretending you're an airplane, and you're flying around all over your house. Then you get to the top of the stairs, and you have to decide, am I really an airplane? Or am I pretending, you know, is this make-believe? Is this a story that I'm telling? And so we want our kids to be literate in the Jewish literature. And it's true that at early ages, sometimes the line between fiction and reality is a little bit fuzzy, and that's why we come back to the stories at a later age so they can first learn the story and then understand the history behind it. But when it comes to holidays like Hanukkah, we want them to have both at the same time. We want them to get a sense that this is an important story, but it's also a story. I mean, I don't know that there are a lot of people out there who are reading Greek mythology and all of a sudden believing it to be true, because they know that this was literature. It reflected what people once believed but don't necessarily believe today. Or maybe they were just creating stories and using the gods to express their stories. And the same can be true for Jewish literature, mythology, belief, and so on.
Two things that I'm kind of taking from two different sources, and I think they come together to raise the question. The first is, when we look at Greek literature, the Greek gods, when we look at Shakespeare, the problem with the comparison is that people today aren't building lives around Greek literature, around Shakespeare, right? They're reading it as literature. Even Greeks, I think for the most part, they're reading it as literature. They're not trying to sort of in any way live out the stories of the Greek gods or whatever, right? And what we're hoping is that somehow this Jewish literature, this Jewish mythology, nevertheless, still today, could form some basis for living a life in some fashion. And I don't know that we have good models in Greek literature or in Shakespeare for that. And on the flip side, I recently was reading Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens, and one of the things that he talks about is that the basic reason why Homo sapiens have been able to be so successful as a species is because they tell each other fictional stories. And he gives a good example of money as a non-objectionable story, right? And then we have these ideas that we that are not supernatural, but nevertheless are fictional and really are just, the reason why money has value is because we all agree to pretend that money has value, but there's actually no basis for its value. And so, again, the question is, if that's kind of human nature and if that actually makes us able to function effectively as a society, then is there some modern, postmodern way in which we might develop a new mythology for Judaism that perhaps was less supernatural, but somehow we still need to have some stories that are at the core of kind of who we tell ourselves we are and what we're here to do?
I think the challenge, though, is first of all, making a new story may be very different than the old story. And this is trying to make the old story do what we want it to do with new values, and that's a little bit more complicated. I think the other challenge is the truth is out there, to quote the X-Files, if anyone remembers that show. The truth is out there. People are going to find this archaeology, this historical background, and if you don't include that in their sense of who they are and how it fits together, there's going to be a mashup, a crash between, well, you've always told me this is what happened, and then the rabbi at the Seder said it didn't happen that way, and what am I supposed to do with all this now? So I think it's a much stronger approach to include this in how you're framing identity, culture, literacy, rather than pretend it isn't there. And there's also a kind of dignity side to it. Do you want to lie to your kids? Do you want to tell them this really happened? Or do you want to be honest? And do you want to say, this is an important story, but I don't think it happened? There's also a sense of dignity to it as well. So the three of us get to know that Hanukkah is really a myth, but the people out there, the masses, don't get to know. At what level, when do you get to the level that you get the real truth? I don't want to live my Jewish life like Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men. You can't handle the truth. I'm not going to tell you what's really happening. I'm not going to share with you my best insights into the reality of Jewish life. I'm not going to live that way. That's not fair to me. It's not fair to them. It doesn't treat them with the dignity they deserve. I think our people can handle the truth, and they can, maybe they do live in mythical, reenactment time. They imagine, we should imagine ourselves as if we were slaves in Egypt. We recline, and so on. That can be useful, but I think you just need to be clear when you're telling the story and reenacting, when you're in a Greek play, and when you're looking at history.
I mean, I agree with that, but I think that there's two questions that essentially I'm trying to ask. One is Lex was asking earlier about the education of children. I mean, I'm comfortable with the teacher in my child's classroom saying that money is a real thing, or the limited liability corporate. I don't know if they would be talking about that, but if they were, that, that there is such a thing, it's called the corporation, et cetera, because, these really are the building blocks of how our society functions, and they're not untruths in the sense that I think I agree about what you're saying about, if we believe certain Jewish stories are true that are not actually historically true. My question isn't whether we should keep telling those stories as true, but whether actually in some fashion the task before us is to build some kind of new stories that, while not exactly true in a factual way, are not true in the way that money is not true, right? Meaning that they're not true in a way that you can still have dignity in talking about them. It's not hiding something, but it's nevertheless getting at this core human need to learn through storytelling in some fashion that's somewhere between fact and fiction, right? And how do we struggle with that?
Well, look, Harari himself talks about the fiction of human rights.
Right.
The fiction of human dignity. There's no natural reason for human rights that all people should have equal permissibility. In a natural world of natural selection, there's no, wolf rights that they enforce on each other in some kind of society. It's bite and bite back. So there are these kind of secular myths, whether it's financial or ethical or otherwise. But at the same time, I think that we might tell different stories. If our goal is not to inculcate a sense of chauvinism, for example, telling people the myth that there's a God of the entire universe who chose one small people out of one small planet in one small corner of the entire galaxy to pay special attention to and to give the unique revelation of all the truths in the universe, what does that do to someone's ego? What does that do to our relationship to other people's, or even to our own group who've chosen to live out that life differently? I would tell a very different story because I have very different values that I want to convey. And I guess the other challenge is, and I did my dissertation on something called modern midrash, which is, modern writers trying to retell these biblical stories with their own values. The challenge is they can't do it in the kind of unself-conscious way that the early rabbis did. I don't think that writers of modern midrash really feel like God is speaking through their fingers on the keyboard as they're rewriting these stories, that it's a kind of ongoing revelation. If anything, it works in a much fuzzier way, with the God as a force kind of vaguely influencing, or it's simply a sense of cultural reconnection on their own terms. So I just think that creating myths just to create myths may be less useful than sharing our people's myths that they have in common and then getting to the facts as well. The other challenge, Dan, I think you'll find in your new book of Jewish myth is good luck getting it adopted across the Jewish world. We all have this early library of Jewish life, these stories. That we have in common, the Bible. We don't have Dan's book of Jewish myth that's going to be taught in all these different schools as the new myths of the Jewish people. I think it's going to be much more successful to have a common ground of dialogue even as we read the stories differently.
So shifting gears a little bit as we turn towards the latter part of our show, I'm curious if, as you look out at today's American Jewish world, if there are any striking trends that you think we should be noting and that should affect the way that we are looking at the world of Jewish institutions and the way that our listeners are thinking about these questions of American Judaism. The numbers from the Pew study are very stark. They showed that 20% of American Jews never attend a synagogue. Never attend a synagogue, not even high holidays. And around 20% said they do not believe in a God or universal spirit. That's not certain. That's a different category. 20% said absolutely not. Nothing. Not even a universal spirit. By comparison, only 7% of the American population in general were willing to say absolutely not. So you've got 1 million American Jews who say they don't believe in a God or universal spirit, 1 million American Jews who never attend a synagogue. They're not always the same people because some non-believers go to synagogue. 25% of American Jews say they're Jewish but not religious, and 32%, almost a third of millennials who say they're Jewish say they're not religious. That's going to change all kinds of experiences. Did you know that being an affiliated member of a synagogue is now a minority experience? The majority of American Jews at any moment, according to Pew,
are not affiliated. So the assumption that Jews are affiliated and the exception is the unaffiliated, wrong. The weirdos, the unusual ones, are the ones who actually join something. We talk a lot about interfaith marriage, and we imagine you've got a believing Jew and a believing Christian who make a partnership. But those millennials, a third of them are not religious, of the Jews. A third of the non-Jewish millennials are also not religious. They're not going to be interested in saying the bedtime Shema and finding a way to bring God in their lives in different vocabulary. That kind of interfaith outreach is not going to work for them. They're actually what I sometimes jokingly call interfaithless couples. They're not neither one of them is religious. Conversion, what? Why? That has no relevance to them whatsoever, because the non-Jew is not going to go through a religious conversion. And what if the Jewish one is the non-believer? Then creating Jewish opportunities that are only religious, that are only God-focused, are not going to work for them. We need to provide alternatives so that you don't have to say something you don't believe to light a Hanukkah candle or to celebrate Shabbat or to find a community. There's a wonderful Jewish tradition of not saying things you don't believe, whether it was in response to crusades and martyrdom or in the sense of being willing to change. The Reform movement that edited the prayer book said, we don't believe in a return to Zion, so we're not going to say it. It is old, it is traditional, but we don't believe it anymore. So now we have to make some changes. There's a great line in the Talmud, and you can quote the Talmud to whatever you want, of course, but the line is, Shelo yedaber echad bapeh ve'echad balev. Do not say one thing in the mouth and one thing in the heart. Have a sense of integrity, that what you say is what you mean, and that you mean what you say, and you can celebrate the continuity that's appropriate with a sense of integrity that provides inspiration and motivation.
So just wrapping it up with Hanukkah, I wanted to ask you about the kind of people that I think many of them are members of your congregation and many of them are our listeners. And I'm talking about people who live in a home with a partner who celebrates Christmas. Is there some vision that we might have of a way in which this moves forward that, are we talking about a syncretistic Judaism that takes practices from another group, or are we talking about something actually quite different, perhaps grafting together a new creation coming out of this in the end? I mean, it's one thing to talk about the people who are alive today and who we're working with today, but where do we see this moving in the future? And does the Hanukkah Christmas being the most dramatic, maybe, example in modern America, give us a sense of what we might expect or what we might want to see in the future?
Well, I want to tell you one last secret about Hanukkah, and that is how the date was chosen. If you read the book of Maccabees very carefully, it becomes clear that the date chosen, the 25th of Kislev, was the date of a Greek festival. It was the very date on which the temple was defiled. That same date was chosen to mark Hanukkah. It may well be the case that this was one of Antiochus's pagan Greek festivals. Some speculate it might have even been his birthday celebration because he saw himself as a god and a king. And so, ironically, we are the only ones still celebrating Antiochus's birthday, and we still light candles. We don't blow them out. But Hanukkah has always had this kind of syncretistic. Judaism has always had this drawing in elements from the outside, whether it was the afikomen at the Seder or the reclining after a Roman feast, the universal human phenomenon of lighting lights when it's dark out that we draw into Hanukkah. There's always been this bridging to the outside world, even in the 20th century with the adoption of commercialism. I think that Hanukkah remains one of these, maybe it's the last marker out the door for some people, but it is an abiding marker of someone being different and being connected to Jewish family and culture. And by the way, there are Jews where both, Jewish homes where both parents are Jewish that still have Christmas trees. The Reform movement for a long time had large numbers of their people do Christmas trees. Because they saw it as a secular American holiday. It's like Xmas instead of Christmas. That's how or a holiday tree or a Hanukkah bush or whatever they called it. But it wasn't uncommon to see that even into the 1950s and 60s. Less common now, but now it's changed again because of the intermarriage phenomenon. So for some Jews, it's anti-Christmas. They are more and more annoyed the longer November goes into December. Every time they turn on the radio, every store they go into, they go crazy. There are other people who are kind of bemused by it. It doesn't affect me. It's not my issue. And there are other people who are acculturated to it. They know all the carols, and they don't mind it so much. One year I was in Israel during a Hanukkah-Christmas overlap. It was a very surreal experience because I was walking around and there was no red and there was no green, and there was no tinsel, and there were no Santa hats, and there was no Christmas music, and I felt kind of weird. I can imagine that there are Americans living in Israel who, on December 24th, go into a sealed room with no windows and sing Christmas carols just because they miss them, and they don't want to admit it. So the question of whether it's going to be an officially syncretistic event, I think, is going to be complicated, in part because there is no one Jewish tradition or one way to do Judaism. There will be families, certainly ones with Christian and Jewish partners in them or of Christian and Jewish heritage, who will be doing Hanukkah and Christmas together. I mean, the Christmaka card market is only going to grow. At the same time, there'll be Jews who maintain a Hanukkah-only approach, even in the secular department, because they self-define as we don't do Christmas. And I think there may be others who begin to adopt it as a kind of secularized holiday tree event. Remember, that secularization process is not only affecting the Jews. There are large numbers of non-Jewish Americans who are secularized. Even Richard Dawkins, the celebrated anti-religious atheist author, enjoys having a Christmas tree. And if Richard Dawkins wants a Christmas tree, then I can imagine secular non-Jews married to secular Jews might also want to have a Christmas tree too. But we in the Jewish world need to take a different approach. In the past, it's been Jewish or, Hanukkah or, us or them, in or out. And the reality today, with the fluidity of identities and the concept of being multiple identities at once in a household, in a family, as an individual, is we have to be willing to be Jewish and. Because if we say either or, they're going to say not you. If we say you don't get to do Hanukkah unless you get rid of that Christmas tree, they're going to say, I don't have to listen to you. They're going to do what they're going to do anyways. So we have to be more open to this new population of people who are going to want to do both or syncretize the two. And it's our job to make the value proposition to say, here's why more Jewish would be even more satisfying, meaningful, and motivational for you and for your family. But to demand they do only one or the other is not going to respond to reality, and it's not going to open the door for a longer conversation.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for enlightening our Hanukkah this year with this perspective, and we're excited to put it all together as we continue this series exploring Hanukkah. So early wishes for a happy Hanukkah to you and your family and all your community. And thanks for being on Judaism Unbound.
My pleasure.
Thanks again to Adam Shalom for coming on to Judaism Unbound. It's been a great episode, and we hope y'all out there have enjoyed listening. As always, we want to close by encouraging you, the listeners, to please be in touch with us, the hosts. We don't like having too much distance between us and our listeners, and we gain so much when we're in touch with you. So here are some ways for you to do just that. The first is through our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound, which you can like. The second is through our website, judaismunbound.com. Our third is through our emails, dan@nextjewishfuture.org and lex@nextjewishfuture.org. And last but not least, we always like to encourage folks to support us with a financial donation if able, and you can do that at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.